Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this Tuesday Scholar event. Our speaker today is Ed Lotterman for the first of a two-part series. Today's topic is A Century of Carnal Covetousness, U.S. Cuba Relations from 1789 to 1903. Ed Lotterman writes the Real World Economics column for the Pioneer Press. He has taught economics at the college level and enjoys explaining the dismal science to non-economists. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota with the financial support of the Ramsey County Library Friends Group. We are deeply grateful to both these organizations. Thank you very much. And now let me turn things over to Ed Lotterman on A Century of Carnal Covetousness, U.S. Cuba Relations from 1789 to 1903. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here. And I have to say, this is a presentation I want to make. It's a presentation I've really struggled with because it's a very big topic. It's not one that I presented on before, and it's sort of been work to get it cut down to what would fit in a session like this. But it's one that means a lot to me. And I should give some background. I usually give economics talks. I was a Latin American history major as an undergraduate. And at that time at the University of Minnesota, there was a lot of Latin American history. I could actually take a quarter-long course in the history of Cuba, as well as one in history of Argentina, history of Mexico, 2 quarters of Brazil. Then I was in the Army Reserve for about 15 years. I was a foreign area officer for Latin America, which meant that it's an additional duty, and you're essentially in the same training program as people who are going to be military attachés. And my particular focus was on Brazil, but in the training, you've got a lot about Cuba because it's a not large country, but it's big in American foreign policy. And then in 2015, I had an opportunity to travel to Cuba, travel around Cuba, became very close to a Cuban family there. And so I've gotten a sort of a deep personal interest in the affairs of Cuba. But the history is important, and the reason I wanted to make this talk, why I said, gee, the next time there's a chance for a Tuesday with a Scholar talk, I want to do one about Cuba, is that I read Ada Ferrer's history of Cuba as an American story, and it was a Pulitzer Prize winning history that came out about 3 years ago. And I read that. There really wasn't anything new in terms of the facts, but the interweaving of U.S. politics and U.S. interests with Cuba, and the fact that these aren't 2 separate countries that sort of intersect occasionally. The history of the two is interwoven more closely than perhaps any other 2 countries in the Western Hemisphere, possibly with the exception of Mexico. At the same time, we've had this national debate about how we teach history and what we don't teach in history. And then the sharp retorts, well, you can't rewrite history. To which my response is, well, if you've been teaching lies for a couple of centuries, maybe you need to rewrite history, or at least, redo how we teach it. And finally, there's a sense that we're on the cusp of some changes. I hope we're on the cusp of some changes in foreign policy that may give us a chance to redo what I see as a national policy relative to Cuba and to much of the rest of Latin America, but has been harmful to our own interests, but it's prevailed for 6 decades because of domestic politics. Now, why, excuse me, I'm an old man on blood pressure meds and I need to sip water. Why carnal covetousness? And the answer is that our desire to incorporate, take over, own, control Cuba simply was different, more organic, more visceral than our other territorial ambitions. We wanted Oregon, we wanted California. I suppose we wanted, to pick up wherever the boundary is between the Louisiana Purchase and what we took from Mexico. But we wanted those territories, but somehow Cuba was different. And then a phrase that came back to me from my Cuban history course in 1971, we simply lusted for Cuba to be ours. We wanted it to be ours. We wanted to own it, possess it. Here's some trivia questions, and I want to come back at these at the end, and they have a purpose. Just the question of who discovered Cuba? And that actually comes from Professor Ferrer's history. She met someone, in an airport lobby or something, and waiting, and was asked, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm writing history of Cuba," and something about, Christopher Columbus, and it was an American, and he turned to her and said, "Oh," he said, "did Columbus discover Cuba too?" Now, Columbus never set foot on the mainland of North America, but we view it, Christopher Columbus discovered America, and that was us, the United States. So that's just something about attitude. Second, Florida historically wasn't a British colony. How did we end up with it in the United States? Why did a U.S. vice president take his oath of office in Cuba? And he almost died there, missed by actually a few days. Why was there a dramatic shortage of hotel rooms in Havana from April into the fall of 1865? And if you watch Gone with the King, Gone with the Wind, when you have these dashing, rich, unscrupulous blockade runners like Rhett Butler, when they ran the blockade, where'd they run to? Why was shipping from Galveston, Texas to Havana so particularly lucrative in the same time, in the spring of 1865? But why did our lust for Cuba change dramatically in 1886 as it had in 1865? And finally, what did the word filibuster originally mean? Before it was something in the Senate. And then I had one at the end that really goes out past the chronological end, but I didn't want to delete it, and I'll just tell you the answer right now. What's larger, 240,000 over 7.1 million, or 100,000 out of 2.5 million? The first is the proportion of Cubans who left Cuba after 1950, from 59 through 63. The second is the number of loyalists who left the new United States after 1783. And a slight higher proportion of loyalists left the United States than left Cuba for other places. This is just the cover of Anna Ferrer's book. And yes, she's from a Cuban family that tangentially includes Mel Ferrer, who was married to Audrey Hepburn. Sorry. Another good, besides Wikipedia and sort of academic histories, if you are interested in a country practically anywhere in the world, back in the Cold War days, American University had a huge, multi-million-dollar contract to write area handbooks about virtually all countries in the world. And they were last redone in 1976, but they remain useful just for looking up information. And I went back to my old area handbook for Cuba a few times in this. Now, just a bit about geography and demography. The government of Spain, the Spanish elites, always called Cuba the Pearl of the Antilles. It's the largest island in the Caribbean, 42,000 square miles, which is almost exactly Tennessee or Virginia. That's about half of Minnesota, or 7 times Puerto Rico. And I think if you talk to Puerto Ricans, sometimes they say, what are we, chopped liver or something? Why is all the attention on Cuba and so little on us? But Cuba was just much bigger, much closer, and economically much richer. The population of Cuba now is 11.1 million and falling slightly. It was 7.2 million or so when Castro came to power in 1959. And it rose, but it had the slowest population increase of any Latin American country, and it's falling. That's a population density of about 270 people per square mile. Minnesota is about 69, Tennessee 168, Virginia 207. The Netherlands, which is densely populated, 1,168. So it's a fairly large island, more densely populated. It's not as rural or agricultural as Minnesota, but similar to Virginia and the same size as Virginia. It's a very long island for its territory, sort of between perpendiculars, as they would say about boats. It's 700 miles from the easternmost point to a line under the westernmost point. About 750 miles if you, I should be using my cursor here, 750 miles if you draw an arc, and if you had to go on roads, it would probably be about 820 or so. It averages 56 miles wide, but it's only 28 in here, and it's about 75 here. And it's only 50 miles from Cuba to Haiti. That's a very small strait. And just off the map here is the tip of Mexico near Cancun, and that's 125 miles. Now, Havana to Tampa, Florida is 300, and Havana to Miami is 235. But it's important to remember, if you go back and read about the 18th and 19th century histories of Cuba, Miami didn't figure in anything. And a year before the Spanish-American War broke out, or before we went to war to grab Cuba from Spain, the population of Miami was 300 people. And so Tampa on the West Coast was the important city in terms of interactions between the United States and Cuba. Americans emphasize some sort of strategic military advantage to having Cuba, whereas slavery was actually much bigger. But there are sort of geopolitical defense issues, and this was Spain. Spain had Mexico. I mean, Spain in the 1600s, Spain after Cortez. And you got wealth from this colony and from Peru and Bolivia and so forth, the whole West Coast, to Spain, and it had to go through the Cuba Straits. And not only that, but the port here is Veracruz, and that's where everything from the Philippines had to come. So you had the Manila galleon that came to the port of Acapulco, and things were taken across the isthmus on the backs of mules and then reloaded, and it had to get to Spain. But these are troubled waters, and that's why you find the ships there, the sunken ships. And this is just a sort of an inset of you had wealth here in Mexico that came up the West Coast from Peru and Bolivia and Chile, and you had to get it out, and it had to go through, to the north of Cuba and through the Bahamas and the smaller islands, Turks and Caicos somehow. But the United States, sort of give John C. Calhoun and Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams and so forth their due. In the 1820s and 30s and 1840s, particularly before railroads, if you had anything coming out of the Mississippi River, anything coming down to Mobile Bay, anything coming out of Houston, Galveston, or later Corpus Christi, it had to go around the southern tip of Cuba, and that was a choke point. And there were sort of legitimate concerns of, well, what would happen if the British took this, or if some other country had it? Overblown, and the underlying issue always was related to slavery, but should not be discarded completely. And then the same thing was true in spades after we got the Panama Canal. That joined the West Coast, and San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, Tacoma. And so everything from the West Coast to get to the East Coast by sea has to come through here. And it can go up to New Orleans, or it can go to New York. And this map is distorted. The Panama Canal is almost straight south of New York. But again, just as for the Spaniards, there's a choke point. And in this case, the best route is between Cuba and this is not Puerto Rico, this is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. But this was a legitimate concern. It was one of the reasons why we grabbed Cuba. It was before we had even started on the Panama Canal, but warmonger Theodore Roosevelt and his friend Elihu Root were thinking ahead. And that's how we ended up with Guantanamo, not something back here, but for $200 a year in gold, we grabbed a huge, deep water port right at the point where all commerce had to go through, and we're still hanging on to it. So why the lust? Well, there's this overarching ethos of the desirability and the inevitability of U.S. territorial expansion. And the phrase manifest destiny nobody coins the phrase until decades later. But from even before the Constitutional Convention, back when we're under the Articles of Confederation, people like Thomas Jefferson are writing about, how we are going to expand, and that expansion always implicitly or explicitly includes we're going to have Cuba. So that's what we're going to look at. We've just covered sort of the geopolitical realities of location, where Cuba is and what trade has to flow past it and so forth. But then beyond this underlying or overarching ethos of we're an important country and our destiny is to expand, and we were as single-minded about that as Putin is about there is no such country as Ukraine, it's really Russia. And we were about as bloody about it as he is. But beyond that overarching belief that we had it by right, there were specifics of U.S. power, of U.S. domestic politics. And as with many other things, it was around slavery. Where would there physically or geographically, where would slavery exist? Where would that be the economic system? And what political power would the slave states have? How many would there be? And then increasingly over the 1800s, the issue of trade with Cuba and U.S. physical investment in Cuba, i.e. buying up plantations, and commerce, selling things to Cuba and buying things from Cuba. And then toward the end, financing within Cuba. And that is at the very end, but an indicator of that would be that a few decades later, if you pass the cutoff point for this talk, the United States intervenes in both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The intervention into the Dominican Republic is because explicitly the First National City Bank of New York said, we want the US government to come in here. And so by the time that we seize Cuba, that we take Cuba from the Cubans and from Spain, the idea of that we have finance, that we make loans, that we have banks in Cuba is a factor. Now there's Thomas Jefferson, and he does write about how Cuba should be ours back in 1786, but it's fairly convoluted. But these two are more direct. And in a letter to someone in 1809, he talks about the inevitable expansion of the United States. And he starts it by saying, I would immediately erect a column on the southernmost limit of Cuba and inscribe on it a ne plus ultra as to us in that direction. Now that's a Latin phrase that means not beyond here, sort of a limit. But in this context, Jefferson is saying, that's the point. We're taking everything up to there. And okay, south of there, we don't mind, but the southern tip of Cuba, that's going to be our southern border. And then 11 years later, writing to another one, he said, Cuba is, quote, the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states. We ought at the first possible opportunity to take Cuba. Then there's John Quincy Adams. And perhaps because of the film Amistad, I think he has a bit of a reputation as being well, he was a man of integrity, but being a very humanist, kind, justice-seeking man. But he was into raw power politics as well. And this is writing in 1823. There are laws of political as well as physical gravitation. Cuba, forcibly disjoined from its own unnatural connection with Spain and incapable of self-support, can gravitate only toward the North American Union, which by the same law of nature cannot cast her off from its bosom. And this is almost Kipling's white man's burden. I mean, it's racist, it's colonialist. You know, our role somehow in history is going to be that we are going to control that. Spain can't. The people there themselves can't. They're not able to run something like that. And so we're going to take it over, and we're morally bound to take it over. A bit more on John Quincy Adams. It is scarcely possible to resist the conviction that the annexation of Cuba to our federal republic will be indispensable to continuance and integrity of the republic itself. So it's not just, gee, it would be nice to have some more land. We need to take Cuba for the continuance and integrity of the republic itself. And then there's James Monroe. And think back to how you studied about what you learned about the Monroe Doctrine, and I think you got something fairly bland about the United States saying European countries could not interfere in Western Hemisphere politics. It came out of not a crisis, but deep debate within American government as to what to do about Cuba, and there was, could we take it from Spain? Could we buy it from Spain? If we didn't do anything, would Britain step in? And this is at the height of Britain's colonial expansion in Asia and then into Africa. And so there was the issue, well, what are we going to do about it? And an explicit statement about Cuba's ours and keep your hands off, but what came out was a bland declaration, fairly remarkably bland given the debate that preceded it. But that basically says other people, other nations, especially Britain, have to stay out of the Caribbean and Central America. And if they do, we will too, but our fingers are crossed behind our back. We really don't mean this. We're saying, Europeans, this is our backyard. You stay out of it. And we will too. We'll let these people run their own affairs. But we don't really mean that. Now, what was a sort of an overt statement, what some people would have liked at the time of the Monroe Doctrine, was the Ostend Manifesto of 1854. And you have Franklin Pierce, a New Englander. He's a Whig, as was Abraham Lincoln at that time, but he's a doughface, and the doughfaces were Northerners who favored the South. He's a very unhappy and unsuccessful president. When he's sworn in, his wife says, I'm going back to New Hampshire. I'm not up for this. They've just lost a son who was nearly decapitated in a train accident. So he's a very unhappy, depressed man. He's very susceptible to pushing and shoving by powerful people within the government. And there are three of his ministers, his ambassadors to European powers. One is Pierre Soleil, born French, ended up in Louisiana. He's been a Louisiana senator, and he's our envoy to Spain. And he's a hardliner in terms of, we want to get this from Spain and we'll buy it. And if you won't sell it to us, we'll take it. Then there's James Buchanan. He had just been Secretary of State, and he would be president in 2 years. And then a man named John Mason. He was a Jackson Democrat from the state of Virginia. He had been the U.S. Attorney General. He'd been the U.S. Secretary of the Navy. He was the envoy to France. And the three of them get together in the Belgian port of Ostend to draft a statement on what they think U.S. policy should be to Cuba and to how do we deal with Spain about Cuba. Do we cozy up to them and make offers, or do we threaten them? And Pierce, Buchanan, and Mason assumed this was an internal policy paper. And Pierce Olay saw it as a crowbar to get things moving. So it's a fairly short document. You can find it online in a PDF. But the key things, the United States ought, if practicable, to purchase Cuba with as little delay as possible. And it goes on, Cuba is as necessary to the North American Republic as any of its present members, and it belongs naturally to that great family of states. Now, this is 4 years before Minnesota became a state, so maybe he wouldn't have said as necessary as any of its present members. But we need it. Indeed, the Union can never enjoy repose nor possess reliable security as long as Cuba is not embraced within its boundaries. And then there is the dirty, racist underbody. We should, however, be recreant to our duty, be unworthy of our gallant forefathers, and commit base treason against our posterity, should we permit Cuba to be Africanized and become a second San Domingo, Haiti, with all its attendant horrors to the white race, and suffer the flames to extend to our own neighboring shores, seriously to endanger or actually to consume the fair fabric of our union. And that is an understated fear, prejudice, whatever, behind all of this. Sort of, we don't want anyone else to have Cuba. If we can't have it ourselves, we don't want it to be independent, because then there's a large African-American or African component to the population, and it will become another Haiti. And we can't have that example of Blacks governing themselves, however well or however poorly, that close to us. Now I'm making a jump here. That's, excuse me, sort of the political thought background. Now I want to talk a bit about the economic relationships and about which interact with the factor of slavery and which states will have slaves and which states, you know, how many slave states will we have? How many votes will we have in Congress? Where will slavery take place? And so slave trading was a huge factor in U.S. relations with Cuba way back from the 1600s. And, you know, we talk about Southerners who wanted to lie about history and talk about the War of Northern Aggression. But the Northern United States was integrated into an economy that, you know, that had slavery as a major element. And, you know, Cincinnati, Ohio packed hogs to feed slaves, hogs from all over the you know, the eastern, what is now the eastern part of the Midwest, you know, went to feed slaves. Slavery ran on food from that area. And slave trading was hugely important to New England. And it remained important to New England after some New England states outlawed the slave trade, after the Wilberforce Act in England outlawed the international slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and said that Britain would act with its navy to suppress it. After we outlawed it, and after Spain outlawed it, the slave trade continued. And there were sort of two factors. It was very profitable, and so it was difficult to completely suppress. And also, there were many people in the governments of the United States and of Spain and of Cuba who were fine with it going on. And, you know, U.S. slavers, U.S. slave ships, U.S. financing of slaves, U.S. equipping of U.S. ships were important in the slave trade, not only between Africa and the United States, but between Africa and the Caribbean, Africa and Cuba, Africa and Haiti, Africa and Santo Domingo, and even between Africa and Brazil. And that continued. The United States did try to suppress the slave trade coming to here, but often turned a blind eye to U.S. slavers leaving Providence, Rhode Island, or Baltimore, or Boston, what have you, going to get slaves in Africa and taking them to Cuba or taking them to the Dominican Republic. More than half of the slaves ever brought from Africa to Cuba arrived after 1820, and that was when Spain itself had outlawed the slave trade. And of those slaves that came to Cuba, more than half of them came in U.S. slave ships, U.S. owned, U.S. financed, U.S. built ships, U.S. insured ships. And Cuba served as a, the phrase was that slaves would be brought from Africa to Cuba and they could be seasoned there, like you'd season a ham or season a soup. That is, they could sort of check them for disease, get them used to being slaves, procure false papers for them saying that they had been born in Cuba. And then it was just a hop, skip, and a jump across to, say, Mobile Bay. And the last slaver to arrive in the United States was the Clotilde, a quite small ship, but it arrived at Mobile Bay in 1860. Now, again, there weren't these separate systems, well, slavery in Cuba and slavery in the United States. It was an integrated system. And the slaving industry, slave shipping, the slave trade, had a huge base in New England. And as we'll see, it was profits from that helped finance the textile industry in New England and the machine tools industry and the firearms industry in New England. Not that these industries would never have existed if not for profits from the slave trade, but it was a source of capital, of profits that went into other businesses. And an example of that is a Senator James DeWolf of Rhode Island. He was born in 1764 in Rhode Island. He was a crewman on a privateer, an authorized pirate in the Revolutionary War. And then, along with the rest of his family, he turned it to slave trading when the Revolutionary War was over. His own slave ships made 44 slave voyages prior to the 1808 U.S. ban on slaving. They made many dozens afterwards, well into the 1830s, even after Spain's 1820 ban on the slave trade. Senator DeWolf personally brought 2,000 slaves across the Atlantic to U.S. and Cuba. It was an extended family all enslaving. His family brought 11,000 to the U.S. alone. His brother opened a slave market in Charleston that received newly arrived slaves well after 1808, and that functioned until Appomattox, or perhaps until the capture of Charleston. I'm not sure which happened exactly first. And these, this information gives you a sort of an idea of the power and pervasiveness of slavery, that we could pass a law in 1807, goes into effect in 1808, which says the slave trade is illegal. And someone could open a slave market in impunity and receive slaves, perhaps not over the first dock there, but there would be slaves sold in the slave market in Charleston that had come directly from Africa or had come from Africa after being seasoned in Cuba. And that could function openly until slavery actually was abolished or ended in the United States. Now, the DeWolf family had a Bristol bank, and they were one of the largest financiers of slave voyages for themselves and others. They had a Mount Hope insurance company that insured more than 50 slave voyages in 1805 to 1807 alone. Profits from slaving financed the DeWolf family purchase and growth of the largest textile mill in Rhode Island. And there was a guy named, a mechanically inventive guy named Samuel Colt, who wanted to make guns. And he was an in-law of the DeWolfs. And some of the money for his gun factory and for other machine tool factories or machining factories in the Connecticut River Valley came from the DeWolfs. James DeWolf, the one who was the senator, he owned 3 large sugar and coffee plantations in Cuba, businesses there, and he became a Spanish citizen. And he was the second richest man in the United States by someone has tabulated. And he frequently lobbied John Quincy Adams, not necessarily his bosom friend, but someone he worked with in the Senate. DeWolf had access to John Quincy Adams' offices when he needed it, and he would lobby Adams on the U.S. policy toward Cuba. Then there's Vice President William R. King. Now, King was a little younger than De Smith. Born in North Carolina, when he was in his early 20s, he represented that state in the U.S. House of Representatives. But then he moves to Alabama and he becomes an important cotton planter. His family, including brothers and a cousin, I believe, owned more than 500 slaves. And sort of a little factoid, it was William Rufus King who established and named the town of Selma, Alabama. And he named it Selma after some Greek mythic figure. He becomes the senator from Alabama. He becomes a very close friend of James Buchanan. As senator, he's president pro tem of the Senate. And then in 1852, he's elected vice president to Franklin Pierce. Now, I have to do a little gossiping here. Buchanan was a bachelor, although he supposedly had a courtship with a woman very important in his youth. And there are always all the things about, well, James Buchanan was gay. And that was an issue at the time. In fact, it was Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, who snidely referred to James Buchanan and his male friend as Aunt Nancy and Aunt Fancy. Well, William R. King was the U.S. Senator, slave owner, who was a very close friend of James Buchanan, who lived with him, who shared his bed for more than a decade. So when you read that part of, you read about Buchanan as president, and then there's this male companion he has. This male companion was not just, some guy. He was a very important politician. And tragically for him, he gets tuberculosis. And he is elected as vice president to Pierce. Pierce is a northerner, the dough-faced northerner, but they need a southerner. So King, even though he's in bad health, is put on the ticket. It's a northerner Pierce a Southerner king. And he's elected, but he's tubercular and his health is deteriorating. And there are all sorts of Alabama planters, cotton planters, who also by now have sugar plantations in Cuba. And most of them are in the province of Matanzas, which is about 50, 60 miles east of Havana. And there is an idea there that going to a sugar house, the boiling house, where sugar cane syrup is boiling, sugar cane juice is being boiled down so the sugar crystallizes, that's sitting in there and inhaling, sort of like a croup kettle, inhaling the humid vapors of the boiling sugar, will help you if you have tuberculosis or other lung ailments. So he needs the cure, he goes to Cuba. Congress passes a special act authorizing him to take the oath of office as vice president in Cuba. He takes the oath of office there near Matanzas, and there's a little stone monument. And the cure isn't working. A few days later, a couple of weeks later, he gets on a boat, makes it back to Alabama, dies in Alabama 2 days after his return. Now, the Matanzas is a province, and it's the capital of the city. That's the capital province. And it was the one that had a very high proportion of ownership of plantations by Americans. And so the secondary town in Matanzas is Cardenas. And Cardenas, Cuba, in the 1840s and 50s was known as the American town. And now people, my friends, are from Matanzas. And it's referred to as the Canadian town, because there is a peninsula known as Varadero on the north coast, which the Cuban government turned into a tourist project to try to bring in, as you might go to Cancun or something. And Cardenas is where that peninsula of Varadero leaves the mainland. And the United States embargo has kept U.S. citizens from going to Varadero resorts, but Canadians flock there. And so now people in that area refer to Cardenas as the Canadian town. Where are we in terms of time? We're
about halfway through the time allotted. It's 1:15.
Okay. I think what I want to do now is talk about the slavery issue and how that affected relations. Why were yes, American slave owning planters, cotton planters, were going to Cuba and buying and creating sugar plantations. But what was the political interest? And this over time, early on, there is great interest among Southerners in acquiring Cuba and incorporating it into the United States. And Cuba would be one more state. After all, it was physically the size of Tennessee or Virginia. And Cuba would be a slave state. And that would help tip the balance in the fights, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1830 and so forth, all of those things. Now, there were very optimistic Southerners who said, we will control Cuba, we will make it part of the United States, but that's a very long island. It naturally falls into about 4 or 5 districts. We could have 5 southern states. We wouldn't have Cuba, but we'd have Matanzas, we'd have Oriente, we'd have Pinar del Rio. So that was a vain hope, but there was that hope. So incorporation and just having one more slave state, that really predominated, say, in the 1820s and 1830s and into the 1840s. Now, then there's the that also is going on in our relations with Mexico to a degree that has never been taught in high school history in Texas. You know, why did Texas fight Mexico to set itself up as a republic in 1836? Well, at least when I learned in history in the 1960s, there were these Americans who were crossing into Mexico, and the Mexicans were not treating them very well, so they stood up for themselves, and some of them were killed at the Alamo. But then a few months later, well, an important thing there was that Mexico had outlawed slavery, and the Texans were deeply slave owning. And the fear was that if the Mexican government came north and enforced its laws, that slavery in Texas would be outlawed. And it was better to fight Mexico and become an independent republic than to have slavery abolished. And that was by far the largest single motivation. Now, I have to remember that things were much more fluid. The Mexican effort to become independent of Spain had only started in 1810. It really wasn't finished until 1821, and Spain didn't actually sign an act acknowledging Mexico's independence until 1836, the same time that the fighting over the Alamo takes place. And so we think of Mexico, well, it was this established country there. It wasn't. It was very new, and Mexico itself had they won their independence from Spain. Mexico itself at one time entertained its own, we need to go and seize Cuba. That can be ours, but it will also push the Spaniards away. If we don't push the Spaniards further away, then Cuba will serve as a launching pad for them to come back in and seize Mexico. So it was a very complicated, political and foreign relations milieu. But, Texas is this independent republic. It's a slave republic. And then 10 years later, roughly, we go to war with Mexico. And one of the reasons to go to war with Mexico, to seize Texas, is to have Texas not as a native republic, but as a slave state. And also, we want everything else. What is now Arizona and New Mexico and Utah and so forth had not been all that important. But as we get into the 1840s and before the discovery of gold in California, that became more attractive. So by going to war with Mexico, we get Texas, the Southerners get one more slave state. We get a lot of other land. Abe Lincoln thought this was immoral and opposed it and didn't get back in Congress again. But there is this, we incorporated and it becomes a slave state. Now that becomes moot once the Civil War starts and then the North wins. And then we don't want, the Southerners don't want Cuba as a possible state. They would rather it be an independent country. They can flee there, maintain their slaves there, and operate. But, if enough of us Southerners go there and set up things, eventually we'll be able to take over and we'll throw the Spaniards out. And that actually happens. The trivia question I have about why was there all this stuff from Galveston? The surrender at Appomattox was not an instant surrender of all of the South. It was a surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And there's all sorts of running around, the president of the Confederacy supposedly is dressed in a woman's dress. Jefferson Davis is running to hide and so forth. And slave owners from Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana, move westward toward Texas with their slaves to get on ships to go to Cuba, taking their slaves with them. It's their property. They're going. Now, some go to Brazil also. I mean, just, you know, a few hundred. But if you look at I don't have at the tip of my tongue, the surrender at Appomattox, and then Juneteenth, which is months later. But there is this time almost as if, you know, the rat line for Nazis fleeing to Argentina. There's this rat line of Southern planters with their slaves going to Texas, to Galveston, and getting on ships to Cuba. So you have this hope that there'll be a slave owning, allowing country to which Southerners can flee and which they will eventually take over. But that all falls apart when it becomes inevitable that even in Cuba, slavery will be abolished. And it is abolished in 1886, 11 years after. And then Brazil abolishes in 1888, and that essentially ends slavery in the Western Hemisphere. But as Cuba as a pawn in slavery politics wanes, U.S. investment, U.S. trade with Cuba increases, and it is trade in, you know, sugar and rum, sugar and molasses and rum come this way, machinery goes that way. It's a time when the sugarcane industry is transforming into much larger steam-driven mills, and northern machinery manufacturers, you know, have a heyday selling things. And for many years between 1850 and 1900, Cuba was the United States' second largest trading partner after Great Britain, above France, you know, above any other country. We had trade with Great Britain, and we had trade with Cuba, and then we had trade with everyone else. So it goes from slavery is a central issue, trade is a big issue. After the slave owners fleeing, there are just many, many more Americans that are buying land in Cuba, establishing plantations. That's why there's a Hershey, Cuba. It was owned by the Hershey Chocolate Company because that's where they sourced their sugar. And so as the sugarcane industry grows and becomes more technologically mechanized, U.S. ownership of it and interactions with it and financing of it grows. And that brings us, you know, toward the end of our period. And so that we can have questions, I'll just say, you know, we've ignored the Cuban people in all of this. And the Cuban people have struggled against control from Spain from the 1600s on. And there are a series of revolts. Some are revolts by landowners. Some of them are revolts by slaves. Early on, there are some revolts by the remaining Aboriginal, the indigenous peoples. They're mostly wiped out. But there is resistance to Spain that is always there. And that waxes and wanes with politics in Europe. And when Napoleon invades Spain, overthrows the monarchy and installs his brother as the king of Spain, that's an impetus for the independence movements all over Latin America around 1810. Because Spain is in disarray, the Spanish government is in disarray. These Frenchmen are there to, you know, essentially to rape Spain and steal from Spain, but they're not all that concerned about what's happening in Peru or what's happening in Cuba. And so whenever Spanish politics are in disarray, independent movements rise. But it takes until the 1820s for example, Peru gains its independence in 1824, Mexico in 1821. I think for Venezuela and Colombia around 1817 or so. I'm a little rusty on that. But there are indigenous, Cuban, white, mixed race, whatever. There's a series of independence movements. And they get stronger and Spain gets weaker. And in this, there often are Cubans, especially landowners, who are willing to change sides, who go to successive U.S. governments and say, hey, could you own us instead of Spain? And that tips administrations, it never quite works out. But by the 1880s, the Spaniards are exhausted. And by the 1890s, they make a try. They bring in a general whaler, Valeriano Whaler. He has a sort of a scorched earth policy and lock up the women and children in concentration camps where they will die. It's the last brutal attempt to repress Cuban independence. And it's Whaler who coins the phrase concentration camp. And then the British implement it in the Boer War in South Africa. But the phrase concentration camp originates with the Spanish general Valeriano Whaler. And the Spaniards essentially, they fire Whaler, send him back home. They essentially have given up. They just haven't withdrawn, but they've given up. And they're sort of there. We have the keys. We're going home. Who would like the keys? And they didn't really want to give the keys to the indigenous Cubans who had fought for independence. And the United States, we have a change of administrations. We have, Teddy Roosevelt is the Secretary of the Navy, and Teddy Roosevelt is an admirable man, but he's a warmonger and a colonialist. And his best friend, Elihu Root, is Secretary of State. And they're determined that Cuba is not going to gain its independence. We're going to get it from Spain. And so we intervene in sort of I'm not sure what, tragicomic 6-week war. We have the, Teddy Roosevelt's courageous assault up San Juan Hill, the British, the Spanish naval fleet that's gathered in Santiago, the big harbor with the eastern tip, sails out and is massacred by the U.S. Navy. But just as with the Mexican War, when we fought Mexico, it wasn't just for Texas, we wanted everything else. And when we fought Spain for Cuba, it wasn't just Cuba. We wanted Puerto Rico too, but we also wanted the Philippines. And so we have Admiral Dewey bravely sailing into Manila Bay and shooting up the old Spanish ships there. And we've not only seized Cuba, but we have a colony, a large colony in Asia. But there's opposition to this within the United States, including people like Mark Twain, and including the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And so we hold on to the Philippines brutally until 1940. But we have to give up legal control of Spain. They become a republic. But as a republic, under a treaty with the United States signed with so many provisions giving the US power to intervene, that Cuba remains a quasi-colony until 1959. But that's another lecture, and this is probably a good time to go to questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ed Lotterman, for a very interesting presentation. We do have some questions already, and I think we have time for more. So I will say to the audience, now is your chance. If you do have a question, put it in the Q&A line and I will ask it in the order that I receive it. The first question is, it looks like, I'm sorry, it's rare that I really don't understand a question, but this one I don't understand. Why was Sewell not the envoy to France? Because he knew the languages, e.g. he knew the languages. Can you explain?
I think because, let's just say that he left, he had been, I couldn't tell you exactly where he was sort of in the Napoleonic era, but he was sort of persona non grata. He had fled France because he was a political, he was seen as a traitor, I'll be politically, he was sort of a MAGA guy, you know. He was trying to overthrow the government of France. He wasn't, and so he fled from France because he was a political refugee. Went to Louisiana, established himself, became rich there, became a senator, and he could go to France because he's a U.S. diplomat by this time, but he's sent to Spain because he would have been persona non grata to the French government.
Yeah.
And by that time, as a Louisiana slave owner and planter, he doesn't care so much about France. He wants Cuba. And to get Cuba, you have to deal with Spain, and I'm the man to do it. And the other little thing about the Austin Manifesto, it was supposed to be sort of a policy proposal, but Sewell immediately blew it up in the press. And it was, I'm going to force these guys to get going by, you know, we're not going to talk about this behind closed doors. This is what we're going to do. And unfortunately, it blew up. And there was vast opposition in the North, and Pierce had to step back from it. And that's why Pierce was a one-term president. And then we get James Buchanan, one-term president, and then we get a civil war.
I see. Okay. All right. Is there any possibility that the United States would ever offer territorial or state status and economic support to Cuba? What factors might make this feasible? Well, would the Cubans entertain such a possibility? I would also add.
That was possible in 1880 when it was Cuban landowners who were petitioning. It will never happen now. I think it would be very, very possible to reverse our stupid policy of the last 63 years and have good relations with Cuba. And I mean, well, I served in Vietnam. We fought about Vietnam. 58,000 Americans died there, and we have pretty much normal relations with Vietnam, you know. And Castro never fought with us, but the Castro regime, the Cuban revolutionary regime, humiliated us, and they made nice because they had few alternatives. They made nice with the Russians, and the Russians put their missiles there, and there was a crisis. And then, you know, 250,000 Cubans came, often for very good reasons. And we established the Cuban community in Miami, and that has tremendous local power, and, you know, captured the Republican Party in the United States. And so we never reverse it. But it's not in our interest, and it's not in Cuba's interest. And at some point, that policy will end. And the Cuban people will welcome it. I hope it happens soon. You know, Cuba asked us for aid last year after the hurricane, or earlier, yes, last year.
Yes.
And we didn't even respond. We didn't even say. And that was, I mean, the Cuban economy is on the ropes. They are desperate, and they asked for aid, and we didn't even say sorry. We just ignored it.
The next question is, can Americans travel to Cuba? And I seem to remember that during Obama's term, wasn't the travel ban lifted? Was that temporary, or is What is the status now?
I think it is essentially the same as it was. Now there was COVID, which really threw a monkey wrench in the works. But you couldn't just travel. You could go on a cruise. You could go as a part of an educational experience. You could go as a journalist. You could go as a researcher. You could go on religious things. And so a little church in my hometown in Southwest Minnesota has sent, church work groups to paint church buildings, and they wanted a translator, and I went along, and that's how I fell in. This Cuban family fell into my heart, and there are ways you can game the system, and I can claim to be a journalist, and I can claim to be a researcher. And if you know something, if you know somebody in the Episcopal Church, I'm sure we could get their Archbishop Griselda, a woman, I think Griselda would, or then the Archdiocese of Orlando, there are ways you can get in, but you have to have some sort of in, somebody who will furnish a letter, somebody who will invite you, somebody who will attest to your status as something.
In this context, maybe I should say, if there is someone in the audience who's thinking of traveling to Cuba, that my 20-something son spent a week in Cuba, and I'm sure it's what you say, Ed, that he had some ostensible reason, but truly, he was just curious to go. He spent a week there. I think it was in the winter of 2019. It was before the pandemic. So yeah. Okay, moving on. Who were the leaders in Cuba at the time of the time that you were speaking about in your talk? Were they controlled by the Spanish, or were there some native Cubans who rose to power during this time?
Well, it depends on when. It generally was not Spaniards born in Spain. There was the phenomenon in all of the Spanish colonies where the king could appoint colonial officials and people in the church. And so they would go and they would stay, and they would have married, have children, whatever, and then their children would be there. But when you needed a new archbishop, or when you needed a new viceroy or whatever, they wouldn't choose from those people. They were the Creoles, because the patronage, the King of Spain, was to appoint someone in Spain. So you send another group. But the first generation people there who were born there, the children of previous appointees, they are 100% Spanish, white, what have you, peninsulars, but they're second-class citizens in the colony. And they're disaffected, and it is those people who are the leaders of the independence movements. But that continues, and it continued right up to 1898. So what you usually had, the leaders of independence movements were often, ethnically white Spanish local landlords, often with some power, some money, but who did not feel that they had a good position being in a Spanish colony that was run by people from Spain. They were not listened to in Spain. They had no power in Spain. Spain was milking the colony and doing nothing for it. But it also was, there were revolts by slaves or by free half-caste or mixed race people. There wasn't sort of a one-size-fits-all description of revolts. They varied. Some were pretty much revolts of the elite wanting to keep their local power but not have to answer to Spain. And some were much more poorer people, economically and politically poor people, trying to gain some, power.
All right. Our next questioner asks, although slavery was abolished by law in 1886 in Cuba, did it make a real difference in the lives of the former slaves?
Not a lot. My grandfather, and this will sound like a circuitous answer. My grandfather was a well-educated peasant boy in the Netherlands in 1895. And he was contracted to come and work in vegetable production on the eastern shore of Maryland for 3 years. And Baltimore, this was before subsidized irrigated water in California. Baltimore was the vegetable canning capital of the United States, and tomatoes were produced around Hines, Pennsylvania. And he came, and he was supposed to supervise, and the people doing the stoop labor were all blacks, and they lived in what had been the slave quarters. And when he was there in 1890, I guess he came in 8. That's only 33 years after Appomattox. And the overseers rode horses and had whips. So what had changed for those people doing stoop labor in vegetable production in Princess Anne County? Nothing. Well, I shouldn't say nothing, very little. And, what had happened for sharecroppers in the Mississippi Delta? Very little. And what had happened for people who cut cane in Cuba? Very little. And in some cases, it got worse, because when you got Americans in who were good managers of plantations, and as they got more money out of an acre of sugar cane, it got so that sugar was planted everywhere. And the people who cut the cane in some areas, in prime areas, were not even allowed land for truck garden plots, for garden plots. And Cuba had a very seasonal, all sugar growing places in those days had a very seasonal cutting season, about a 5-month harvest, 5 to 6 month harvest. And the other time was called the Tiempo Muerto, the dead time. And that's when there was no work. You were paid on a daily basis for cutting cane. You were no longer a slave. There was no work during the dead time. You didn't own the bohio you lived in, and you were barely allowed room to grow vegetables. And so there was hunger. There was true hunger in rural Cuba for people. And this was true into the 1950s. I mean, you talk to, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but you talk to some Miami Cubans, and they will talk about how everyone is just so happy in Cuba. There were people in Cuba who were middle class, who worked hard, who, whatever, but there were desperately poor people in Cuba in the 1950s, and there was incredible injustice, just as there was in northeastern Brazil, just as there was on the coast of Peru or the mountains of Peru, but there was incredible injustice.
What about racial attitudes in Cuba? I understand that Cuba did not have the one-drop rule that had this absolute line between black and white, and yet most of the people who left Cuba, the affluent people who left Cuba after the revolution, were of largely Spanish descent. What difference did that make? What was the racial attitude, and what difference did it make to their history?
Race was less important in Cuba than some other countries, and became less so after the revolution. It still exists. And for the last few years, one's well-being in Cuba depends on whether you have someone in Miami to send you money or not. And the lighter skinned you are, the more likely you're to have a relative in Miami, and the darker skinned you are, the less likely you are. And the very poorest people in Cuba still are much darker skinned on average than, but there is a degree of mixing. I mean, you see, there's no profession that's closed to you because of skin color. The 1986 Constitution of Brazil made racism up. It's violating the Constitution, but I can still go to Brazilian newspapers and look in the want ads and say, Uma moça de boa aparência wanted a young woman of good appearance. And that, just as 50 years ago, means not too dark.
I see.
And if you look at Brazilian Navy officers, the officers are quite white. You know, the NCOs aren't. So there's an element of that in Brazil, but I think it's closer to racial equality than many other countries, and it has improved a great deal since 1960.
Okay. And now the next questioner, I think you alluded to this, but maybe you want to go into it in more depth. This person says, what is the point? What was the point of 70 years of sanctions against Cuba?
Well, Republicans got votes. I mean, Florida has people in the, in the House of Representatives. That was maybe unfair, but it was to the political advantage of one party much more than the other party. And why should a Democratic politician sacrifice himself in terms of opening himself up to, to being called a communist sympathizer, soft on communism, that sort of thing, by saying we ought, there was much to be lost and little to be gained politically. If I can, I was a foreign in the Army Reserve. I was a foreign area officer for Latin America for 18 years or something. And you went through the same reduced the training that people are going to be Army attaches go through. And it's at Fort Bragg, it's Special Warfare School. And you could go back, and every year when a class is finishing, they have a little seminar, and they bring in a couple people from State Department, a couple of academics, a couple people from CIA. I have never talked to an American government official, state, military, CIA, where when you talk to them privately and said, off the record, and said, well, what about US policy? I have never heard one of them say, well, that's a good policy for this reason. What they say is, well, it's domestic political considerations, and it's bad, but we shouldn't give it up without bargaining for something else. I mean, that's sort of the diplomat's approach, Yeah, we're in a bad policy, but still we're not going to change until we can get something else. But I have never heard a US official say, this is a good policy that suits US interests. It's always, well, you got to understand domestic politics.
Okay. All right. The next questions relate to the very beginnings of Cuba. What is the name of the indigenous tribe that was wiped out during the original conquest of Cuba? And where did the name Cuba come from?
I'm going on 73 and I have memory lapses. There were two indigenous groups, and the Taino Indians were one. Yeah. And there was some in Ada Ferrer's book, or in the, there's good explanations. It was not just one group, because there were groups from other islands that came. I mean, control of the island was not constant. But the Taino Indians were one major group. They were worked to death trying to find gold, and there isn't a lot of gold in Cuba, just as there isn't a lot of gold in Virginia. But like with everything else, European diseases just killed millions. And Columbus came to the Caribbean in 1492. Pizarro went to Peru, halfway down the west coast of South America, in 1535, or 43 years later. And the reason that Pizarro and 135 men could conquer the Inca Empire was that most of the natives in the Andes had died of measles and smallpox and things like that. And that was true all over the Caribbean.
Were the Arawak people also Cuban?
Yes. but I should just be careful. I knew this all at one time, but I'm getting on thin ice here in terms of what I can recall correctly.
Okay. And I should say, if there's something that you want to look up during the coming week, we are going to see you again next week.
Yes,
So
yes.
we can always, defer. What about the name of the island, Cuba? Where does the word Cuba come from?
I'm drawing a blank on that again also.
Okay, well, all right. Next questioner, what books would you suggest on the topic of Cuba? And I will type them in the chat line if you can give me a title.
Well, for a single volume right now, Ferrer's is pretty good.
Could you give the title of that?
It is Cuba and American History. And
Okay.
her intent is to say that this history of Cuba is an integral part of American history. It's not that there's American history and there's Cuban history, and here's where they sort of contact. Cuban history is an integral part of American history. You can't understand American history without understanding Cuba.
Okay.
There was an excellent series of books, Argentina, People in a Nation, whatever, the Land of the People. I certainly could look up. I haven't kept up with the, sort of the undergraduate textbook type academic literature in the last 3 decades.
If there are books that you'd like to share with the audience and you think of them afterward, just send me the titles and
I will.
When I send out the invitation next week, I'll include the titles. I should say we are running out of time at a rapid clip. We have more questions now than we did when you ended your talk. So we're not going to get to all of them, and I apologize. We'll just plow through and see how many we can get to here. I do want to mention that I can see from the chat line there are a whole bunch of people in your audience, Ed, who want to go to Cuba, who thinks that sounds like a great idea.
Go to Cuba. Cuba is wonderful. I went to Brazil when I was 18 and I fell in love. And I went to Cuba when I was 65. And I fell in love in a way that had not been true since the time I went to Brazil at age 18.
Okay. What is the legacy? Oh, excuse me, go ahead.
And they are a deeply admirable people. They are one has to admire their fortitude and their courage in living a life with dignity in very difficult circumstances, and that is true for many poor people. But I admire the Cuban people.
Okay. Next question: what is the legacy of the U.S. planters who went to Cuba? Are there any recognizable descendants, still there?
That's a good question. I think that some of them, sort of. Yeah, became part of the general population. I mean, there were, they didn't go to one specific, there were ones who went to Brazil and they stayed in a specific area, and you can go there and they still have their march, I suppose it's on some sort of Confederate day, with Confederate flags and so forth. It's in the state of Sao Paulo. There was no maintenance of a specific core like that in Cuba. But I am sure that there were planters who stayed there. And as with the loyalists who went to Canada, there was movement back and forth, and one child would go back and one would not.
Okay. Given its natural resources, what needs to happen for Cuba to achieve economic stability?
It should give up the communist government. But it has never been Switzerland or it has no experience with a democratic mixed market economy. It has been an exploited, colonial appendage of other countries, de facto and de jure. But it should go look at Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a democracy. Costa Rica is a market economy with, sort of good social insurance, government meeting of educational and health and other things. That would be a good model to look at. But the question is, how do you get there from here, from where you are to there? But I think Costa Rica is an example of a small country, Spanish heritage, mixed race, that's doing well.
Given that we have the example of China, which really has evolved without ever stating that they are breaking with their communist heritage, yet they have evolved to a capitalist system, really. Is there any hope for Cuba to retain, lip service adherence to communism and yet evolve in the direction of Costa Rica?
Well, I disagree with the premise. I think that trying to move towards some market or capitalist features, but it always was state centralism. And I think under the current, it's heading back. He's heading very much back. I think if you talk to Miami Cubans, the well-off ones, it's, well, we're going to go back and take over Grandpa's sugar mill, and we're really going to make it run. That generation is dying. That was not honest with me. That generation is dying. But I think inevitably, the Dade County Cubans will want to move back to Cuba and take their rightful place in running the place. And there are many Dade County Cubans who came with nothing and made themselves, who really worked hard to gain something. It wasn't they came with bags of money. There are some good managers. There are very skilled, hardworking, forward-looking, enlightened people in the South Florida Cuban American community. And I think they will be the people who will go back.
Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If you wander around middle-class residential areas of Havana and you see a really nice house and you ask about it, it's owned by someone who lives in Miami, and they come back there to that nice house, but they've sent back money to have it, redone, and maybe a cousin lives there as a caretaker.
Yeah, I'm so sorry we are out of time. I would be remiss if I didn't say that we have at least 10 remarks in the Q&A line at this point, personal testimonies from people who have traveled to Cuba, had a wonderful time. And so to the audience, so, say, take from that what you will. We are out of time today. Fortunately, we're going to have Ed Lotterman back next week, and he'll be talking about a completely different topic, Blame It on Mexico City, how Minnesota's Lucky Lindy was smitten by his smithy. Boy, do I like that title. But for right now, I'm going to say thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.